Jai Hind everybody. I'm sure you all would be aware as to how the Quad was conceived. Despite having been conceived in an early time frame, it has gained momentum last 3 to 4 years, really speaking. The initiative was taken by Mr. Shinzo Abe, the now no more there with us, who was Japanese Prime Minister. Thereafter came AUKUS. There came, the Squad. India is already a member of Quad, and there are requests from the participating countries which have come to the fore recently that they wanted India to also become part of this Quad. Of course, AUKUS is something a different kind of configuration and purpose. But with Trump 2.0, number of things are undergoing a change. At least they are indicating the number of changes which are likely to happen in the world on different fields. One of them is that USA has started seeing China as a primary adversary and is not considering its erstwhile adversary, Russia, which was a thought process during the entire Cold War and thereafter, as its primary adversary. And therefore, the focus in Indo-Pacific is indicating that probably its prime members are going to accord it more importance than to AUKUS and other such organizations. As of now, the Quad has no security commitment like NATO, but there were talks that this is going to be, showcased as Asian NATO, but the security framework is still not there. And given my understanding, India may not like to be part of the organizations, especially in the security structuring, because it would like to maintain its strategic autonomy and the number of other challenges. Because the moment you have the security embedded in a grouping, then the connotation is quite different. If you remember, once the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum was launched, India has been an active member of that, but it has not agreed on all the points which were included in the agreement. It has been selective as it conceives for its national interest. So with growing interest of the Indo-Pacific, there have been increased interest of major countries in the world, including India, to take interest in the Pacific islands, because these island countries, though may be smaller in geographic size, but they have got the tremendous strategic importance and can do a lot to whose side they remain or to whom they provide their strategic facilities. We are very fortunate that we have Mr. Balaji Chandramohan today with us, who has taken all the pain to come from Chennai to give this talk to us on Pacific Islands. I'm sure it will be an eye-opener given his expertise on the subject, as well as his personal experiences in living in some of those countries there. So I would now request Dr. Urupi, our senior fellow, to introduce the speaker, and thereafter we shall request Mr. Balaji to do the deliberation on the subject. Dr. Urupi.
Thank you, sir. Balaji Chandramohan is a research scholar with the University of Madras and had taught strategic studies course at the university. He was previously a visiting fellow with Future Directions International, Perth, Australia. Mr. Chandramohan has studied for his journalism course in New Zealand and has lived in the Pacific Islands such as Fiji. He worked as a journalist in New Zealand. Further, Mr. Chandramohan has worked as a journalist with Lok Sabha TV, DD News, and Asian News International, and worked as an Asia Pacific correspondent for World News. Mr. Chandramohan is an alumni of Geneva Center for Security Policy. He previously worked at MPIDSA and has taught international relations at Indian Academy of International Law. He also worked for Chennai Center for China Studies and has done research for the center. Further, Mr. Chandramohan prepared a detailed report on China's strategic interests in the Pacific Islands and need for India's approach in the region for the Center for Contemporary China Studies. He has published extensively on India's strategic interest in the Pacific Islands and Indo-Pacific, and is also a life member of CENJOWS. Mr. Chandramohan published in journals such as Global Brief, New Zealand Institute of International Affairs, and Romanian Review, and has given interviews in DD News, Radio New Zealand, Radio Australia, and Russian TV. Thank you, sir. I hand over to you.
Yours now.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, DG, for giving me the opportunity, and thank you also to Rupi and all the researchers and fellows who are there with CENJOWS and those people who are actually watching us live. Actually, this subject has been of personal interest to me because way back in 2008, when I was actually studying my journalism, I happened to visit Fiji. And when I did visit Fiji, then I happened to understand that many people of Indian origin were there based in Fiji, or nearly about 40%. But the Fiji had its own problems at that time. There was a military coup there, the military rule was there. But that was actually different from the earlier military coups or the military dictatorship which was there. It was much more friendly towards the Indian people. And at that time, I also understood that the world was changing. The US was actually, after getting caught up with two land wars in Asia, it was actually thinking more about to deal with China. At the time, I thought that we need to, like being an Indian, at that I understood that India has to do more to actually reach out to these countries. And those countries, as Sir actually mentioned, maybe much smaller in size and geography, but when it comes to the strategic significance, it has much more important significance. Then I came back to India. And when I came back to India, then I was working with IDSA. I started to actually interact with a lot of the military officers, especially the naval officers. Then I actually made them to understand the strategic importance. And they also understood that actually that we need to reach out more. But how and why? And that was actually a question. Then so forth, the US also started to develop its own strategic brief, the pivot strategy, which was actually publicly enunciated by Hillary Clinton. It came out in 2012 at Rotterdam and Cook Islands. So the interest for the Pacific Islands started to increase, and that interest also coincided with China's increased ambitions in the Indo-Pacific region. So it all culminated into actually a grand scale at a personal level when our own Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi, happened to visit Fiji. And he did, in fact, talked about the importance of Fiji in India's scheme of things when it comes to the diaspora during the course of the campaign. Then I did mention that I did write that he might actually, in fact, visit Fiji. When I was actually talking about the need for a state visit for from India's perspective to any of these countries, I mean, like Australia, New Zealand, and Fiji. Then very coincidentally, it was very surprising that after attending the APEC summit in Brisbane, he decided to go to Fiji. Then I was there in Fiji at that time. And I was actually there in Fiji because I was actually teaching in the University of Fiji. Then suddenly the Indian High Commissioner there, he actually, Hitesh Sharma, he actually called me and said that we would like to know more about these islands because the Prime Minister has come. And then I briefed them. Then it was actually very, I mean, I gave an interview, then it was actually an eye-opener and people were very much surprised. But now they have actually understood the importance of these islands in grander scale of things. But actually, the importance of these islands was actually in grander scale of things even in World War II. I mean, if you see the Pacific Theater which was there, I mean, like it was actually, there is always a saying that history doesn't repeat itself; it always writes. I mean, the importance of these islands or the importance of these islands was very much understood by Japan because when they had to invade, their actual strategy was to actually control most of the Asian coastline. And being actually important, these islands, they thought that probably they could control the whole of the Indo-Pacific or the Asia-Pacific at that time. But the fact of the matter was, the US also started to understand that. If you see that the US, I mean, much like what Japan understood the whole theater, if you see that the US started to understand that starting from the end of the First World War itself. I mean, they understood that Japan will be a preeminent power and that would challenge US supremacy in the Pacific. So they started to develop the war plans for that. If you see some of the, the older articles, there's actually even an article on how the basing should be there in Micronesia. There's actually an article which came out in a paper which was actually done by the US military officers at that time, starting in 1920, I'm talking. And that very much actually is valid even in how the US is actually controlling many of the islands in Micronesia. Then that subsequently became the blueprint for developing the war plan orange of the US and subsequently the Rainbow Five plans which they developed. They're predominantly the island hopping strategy. All these strategies were predominantly actually pre-thought by them, and that was actually developed as a war game by the Naval War College. So that those islands became very much important. Then, of course, you know that after the attack on Pearl Harbor, then the US started to very much give importance to these islands because along with these islands, they were able to capture Japan. I mean, and they can go to Japan in that way. So the strategic importance was there. But the strategic importance actually become actually more pronounced during the Cold War too, because the Russian Far Eastern Fleet, they also started to give increased patrols in those regions. But those countries which were there, they were predominantly depending on Australia and New Zealand for their economic and diplomatic aid. Most of these countries do have a lot of agreements with Australia and New Zealand. But Australia and New Zealand also started to actually share intelligence with the US regarding these islands. But after the end of the Cold War, you must be knowing that China has got significant population in these islands, and China military officers were collaborating with the US in the Cold War. So subsequently during the Cold War, the China had better advantage than what one could say India for that matter, even though we have a significant number of population there, significant number of expatriate population also because, but still the Chinese had more advantages because they were allowed to, the Chinese military officers could interact with the US military officers and they could actually learn the local languages and they could mingle with the local issues. So that gave them an advantage over, I mean, that is actually the smart strategy of China. They always tend to be friendly, then they used to align with them, just like the way they were with the Soviet Union, then with the US. The same way they were with the US and then they are against us in these islands. So that's the way it is. I mean, that's what even there was actually a great saying in the US Pacific Command actually met the Chinese military officer, Chinese naval commander, and he said that he patrolled this side of the Hawaii, the new this side of the north. But that was actually the concept of G2, which was put in 2009, 2010. The Chinese economy was very much challenging the US. But that is always history. But now what has happened is that the US has understood. After the end of the Cold War, you must be knowing that the US was predominantly focused on saying that the primary security threat to them, the NATO in Europe, was over. So they predominantly started to relax themselves, and they were very much distracted by the terror attacks in 9/11 and also the land wars which they got themselves in Iraq and Afghanistan. So their focus actually shifted from these Pacific islands, and China was very smart enough to get into foothold into these islands and challenge US supremacy. That's how they started to develop the first, second, and third island chain. These islands very much fall within the ambit of the third island chain of the China. Now, from India's point of view, these islands have actually, I mean, even before the concept of imperialism came, we did have trade relations with these kind of islands. There is a book by V.R. Ramachandra Diksha, who is a famous historian, who is a Tamil historian, who has said that Tamilians during the Cholas time did have trade relations with the Polynesian, which is a great kind of origin and spread of Tamils. But subsequently, what happened is that subsequently, because of the globalization, we didn't have that much amount of India being as a country didn't have that much amount of relations with these countries. So our expatriate population was there. But after the independence, if you see even during the course of the independence also, we did actually expose the cause of Fiji independence from the British rule. Say, for example, if you see the writings of Subramanian Bharatiya, he must have actually talked about the need for the sugarcane field and the liberalization which should be there. So India was actually having some kind of interest in Fiji and in the Pacific Islands, but the strategic interest or the military interest was very much not there. But that actually subsequently started to change because we know that, I mean, our Prince Indira Gandhi did visit Fiji in 1971, and she did, that was actually a Melanesian country. Actually, if you see the Pacific Island geography, there are three group of countries. One is the Micronesia, another one is the Melanesia, and another one is the Polynesian country. Micronesian countries where the US has got a lot of military assets there. For example, Guam. If you say Melanesian country, Fiji is a Melanesian country, Papua New Guinea is a Melanesian country, and Polynesian countries, Cook Islands, I'm just giving an example. Cook Islands is a Polynesian country, and Samoa is a Polynesian country. Interestingly, when Indira Gandhi did visit 1971, right, she did visit Fiji. But actually, she did not stop only at Fiji itself. She did visit another important Polynesian country, that was Tonga. So, but that was actually not didn't come out very well. But she did understood that the importance of Tonga, and the importance of Tonga was very much there, basically because when Tonga became independent in 1970, we did provide them the support. Our because international law, they actually provided them the support with the law of the sea and so forth. So in that way, she understood that there is actually an important policy for Asian countries. So, but after that, we also lost interest in the affairs of the Pacific Islands because we were predominantly got our own continental commitments. All the diplomatic initiative was very much there. But subsequently, we started to understand, basically because the reason is basically because as our country's profile was going, as our economic growth was going, our diplomatic strength, we started to show much more interest into that. Say, for example, we did actually started to become an active partner in the Pacific Islands Forum, which was started in 1971, to become an associate member in 2002. And subsequently, we actually, though, I mean, the other way of thinking around is that there was a coup there, which was happening in many of these countries. There was a coup there in 1987. And the coup was very much targeted against our own Indian community. But actually, what we could say that when the coup was happening there was actually a lot of efforts from the whole, our own, because we did have a significant number of population in Fiji, which constitute a lot of our own ethnic communities, both in North and South India. So in that case, there was actually a pressure for the government to act on that. And they were actually connected to it. It's not to say that the Fiji Indians are completely isolated. They were very much connected to it. So in that case, what happened, the government of the day was supposed to actually act, just like the way they acted in Maldives in 1988, or for that matter, Seychelles. And we were actually supposed to act there in Fiji. But there was actually, because we did not have the own logistics and lift capacity, that we could not do that. But we did make sure that we did act on them, and we did actually, but the recent documentary evidences are coming out in a different way. Our own government took the initiative through diplomatic initiative to make sure that the Indians were very much protected. And the subsequent elections in which happened there in Fiji, our own Indian interests were very much there. And the same president who was there actually is the same president right now. So in that case, we did not actually keep our eyes off the Fiji, but though our interest was very much changing. But now we have understood that, in the changing world, as Sarah has actually mentioned it out, that we have, after the coming of the Quad, and that was there in 2007, but the Quad did not actually take it off till 2017 during the ASEAN summit. So till that time, what happened was that, our interest was very much off the radar there. But now we have started to understand the importance of Quad. Apart from that, when it comes to India, I mean, like, we don't have actually, say, for example, we don't have military attaches in any of these countries. We do actually, although our diplomatic initiative is there. For example, we do have a diplomatic posting in Fiji. We do have posting in Papua New Guinea. Of course, we do have posting in Australia and New Zealand very much, which takes care of. Interestingly, what happens is that as a significant move recently, about 2 years before, we started to understand the subtle nuances of the important strategic importance of that. Say, for example, the Cook Islands, which has got a very significant strategic significance, which is actually a Polynesian country, which was actually accredited to a Melanesian country, Fiji. Now we understood the importance of that. That's why we shifted the base from the diplomatic accreditation from New Zealand, from Fiji to New Zealand. That attracted a lot of attention, that we actually started to understand more on that. But though, I mean, like, when it comes to China, for that matter, China is very much more advanced when it comes to playing these things. Because they are very much, a member of Melanesian Spearhead Group, which is actually based in Fiji. And the Melanesian Spearhead Group headquarters has got made sure that, they do provide the adequate number of policing to the local, the local countries in which there was actually any kind of civil war. And the New Zealand and Australia also do provide peacekeeping efforts to these countries. Now, when it comes to India, our interest is predominantly, though I understand it's predominantly diplomatic, it is actually getting into much more a military kind of initiative. The reason is because the Pacific Islands, you see very closely, they do actually occupy a very important significant geostrategic position connecting the greater Australasian region to the Latin American countries, the western coast of the US. So in that case, as much as we reach it to the Latin American countries, we can reach it out to the Pacific Islands through the Pacific Island countries. And for that matter, India happens to have helped some of the Latin American countries in their maritime initiatives. For example, Chile, which actually became independent, which was predominantly under a military rule. When it actually started to become much more, becoming independent in the 1980s and 90s, we did have our own naval attaches there in Chile. And we did help them in their naval programs. That's why even Chile, for example, which is actually a Polynesian country, it has, for example, it is Eastern Islands, for example, has got reach in the Polynesian, and it is actually a part of the Polynesian Spirit group. So in that case, what happens is that we actually have very close relations as per the Latin American countries that can actually reflect in the way we conduct our Pacific something new. So in that case, our interest is growing. For example, we did conduct the first Pacific Islands Summit, which was held in 2014, and that was held in Suva, and our Prime Minister visited there. It was actually a diplomatic, a big diplomatic victory for us as we could actually bring all the 14 states of the Pacific Islands to come to Prime Ministers of the 14 Island Prime Ministers to come and visit our own Prime Minister as the Chinese President was there. So that was actually talked about as a big issue. Then subsequently, the second summit which was held in Jaipur, and the third summit which was held in Papua New Guinea, and it was very surprising. The Papua New Guinea Prime Minister went and actually, he actually took the bow, blessings from our own Prime Minister as an Indian tradition. It was actually watched by the Western media. They were very much surprised. How could he do that? So that's a kind of thing. And we do have what one could say our own, for example, in Papua New Guinea, we do have our own Indian origin, born and brought up in India, not necessarily they were born in Papua. Indians who are born and brought up who are actually holding significant political leadership in Papua New Guinea. So in that case, our profile is growing. See, the other thing which actually attracts, despite the fact that China is increasing its footprint through checkbook diplomacy, one of the things these countries are attracted to India is basically because if you see the first wave of democracy and the second wave of democracy which we benefited, third waves of democracy, these countries benefited from the third waves of democracy. Most of the countries became independent in the 70s, and they very much looked up to India. Though they were not actually a part of the non-alignment or they were not explicitly a part of India's strategic thinking, but they understood that India happens to be a very much an important scheme in the scheme of things. And India happens to also understand that, say, for example, if you want to actually become a member of the UN Security Council, tomorrow, whether as a permanent member with veto or not, these countries are ready to actually accept us. That was actually the game when we actually, our Prime Minister happened to go there. So, and also it gives us a very subtle signals to other things, other countries which are there in the neighbor. Say, for example, when it's Bangladesh or Myanmar, it's not as if they consider that India is actually a country which is blocked in South Asia. They are not our reach. And that happens to be the case. It actually sends us a right positive signals. So that happens to be another way of thinking about that is that, see, the important thing about the Pacific Islands is, if you see the important geostrategy or the geopolitics of these islands, it's very interesting to note that the happenings in one part of the world do have effect in the second part of the world itself. For example, India has got a very good relations with France, which is actually a NATO country. But the fact of the matter is that France has got significant number of military assets in the Pacific Islands because France has got a fleet in French colonies. France has got a what one would say, it's colony there in New Caledonia. But it also actually can complicate, let's say, for example, the Kanak independence movement, which was there in New Caledonia, which can challenge at times India, but that position is not very much there. But if you see the second thing, the second country, and we do have a logistics exchange agreement with France, which means that we can use their military assets, not necessarily in the Indian Ocean itself, but also in the Pacific Islands also. And France also does share intelligence with both Australia and New Zealand. They conduct their annual military exercises. And in that case, we can also benefit that. And second thing about is that when it comes to Indonesia is actually a part of Marinasian sphere group. Indonesia is very much linked to the countries in the Marinasian group. We do have significant the strategic relations with Indonesia, which happens to be the second island chain of the Chinese. So in that case, we could actually reach out to these countries. We could actually also reach out to Indonesia also. So the other icing on the cake is the way in which that Prime Minister Lakson, the New Zealand Prime Minister, was invited as a chief guest during the regional event. It was actually very surprising to everybody that actually, but it's not actually that they used to say that he was actually a Lilliputian influent time. So New Zealand is a Lilliputian influent, actually punching more than its weight. But actually, you have to see that the New Zealand is actually a member of the Pirates Intelligence Group. And it does share active intelligence. Even there is actually a change of command either in Australia or New Zealand or UK, Canada or US. There is actually an active sharing of intelligence. And it is not only the anti-terrorism initiative, the cooperation which we do have with New Zealand, but there are other kinds of cooperation too. For example, we do, New Zealand is actually, its position in AUKUS is very much challenged. It wants to be actually, at some stage, they would like to get into the bandwagon of AUKUS. And so also with the Quad. Because we do conduct the annual military exercises, Malabar military exercises, we do actually happen to Japan, which happens to be the case, India, US. But actually, there is actually in the future, there might be a chance, say, for example, in Indonesia or the Australia, New Zealand might actually join the Quad military exercises to develop the necessary interoperability. So in that case, actually, we have started to much more understand. It's not to say that these countries are very much strategic importance in a bilateral way, but it has got its connotation at the multilateral level. So, for example, being as a part of New Zealand and being as a part of, being on the strategic relations with New Zealand and Australia will actually change the existing status quo that we have at the UNSC. And that will also stay the way because, for example, Australia and New Zealand, as such as we cooperate with Australia and New Zealand and the Pacific Islands, is also true all for the matter of France. It will also change, change the way that we perceive Europe as a country. Today we are being talked about much more as a negotiating part of the Russia-Ukraine war. That is because these countries, though which are there in the Pacific Islands, they have their European connections very much. So in that case, it completely differentiates the way in which that we perceive our geopolitical interests, right? So that happens to be an advantage that we are having. Also, further, there needs to be more to be done. For personal side, what happens is that when you visit these countries, either when you visit Fiji or Cook Islands, what happens is that our diplomatic initiative is very much lacking. Our diplomatic presence is very much lacking. And the diplomatic, there's also a saying that we need to develop a culture of compliance. We need to develop a little bit of sympathy towards these islands, but we don't have it. So that is also something which we lack. Also, very interestingly, if you actually see that, these countries, say for example, these countries also are very smart when it comes to playing the double games. They understand, many people actually, overstate a permanent diplomatic meetings of these countries. Say, for example, the Chinese foreign minister had a whirlwind tour in 2020 to these Pacific Island countries. He did sign a security agreement with Solomon Island countries. The contours of the security agreement was very much questioned. But it is true that these countries were very much attracted to the big money. But they know that because, if you see the local politics of these countries, which are not actually, the bureaucracy, the deep state which is there, they very much want to avail the significant, significant diplomatic, significant geopolitical game which is there. So they want to avail as much benefits as possible. So the best way for them to avail this benefit is to play the double game. The small island countries, the little island countries are very smart in that. So if you see that recently, when the Chinese foreign minister had a whirlwind tour in May 2020, Wang Yi, then what happened was that most of these countries were very much, attracted to China, wanted to find it. But there were actually pressures from them not to sign the deal. Say, for example, they did sign with the Solomon Island countries, but many of these countries did not sign them. So in that case, there is actually a shifting way in which that things were done. How things were done in that way, how things are to be conceived. The other interesting aspect is that recently, the Chinese wanted to also develop their base there. Say some of the islands, for example, Vanuatu, they did wanted to have a base there, but it did not happen. Then they wanted to develop a base in what is called Tonga, but that did not happen. Apart from having a military base or so forth, Chinese are very much also, active part of the way in which the electoral process were there. Say, for example, China was one of the main debating points in Samoa election, which was held in 2020. And then even, for example, in Cook Islands, that issue has actually, it has actually come to a monumental level. The recent signing of deal between the Cook Islands and China, the Comprehensive Security Agreement, the reason is actually not because that it's very simple geopolitics. These island countries, as you say, has got significant geostrategic nature, but it has also got significant rich mineral resources. One of the largest exclusive economic zones are based in these countries. So it is not only the geostrategic, the minerals which are there, the mining which are there. These countries have the significant amount of what one could say minerals which are actually there under sea. So these countries want to look up to China to tap these minerals, and China would like to tap them for that. So that happens to be the game in which that we also have to understand. We are getting into the geopolitics of this region. One of the important aspects is that this is actually like a pickle countries. The Comprehensive Security Agreement was signed just now by the Prime Minister Brown when he went to China. He actually did sign that and he came back and he actually also voted a separate passport for Cook Islands. These two things actually, that has got actually, a big elephant in the room. was there. I mean, that was actually the tip of the iceberg. But the fact of the matter is that when the issue was very much started to be discussed in detail, they were actually very smart enough to say that, our interests are very much aligned with New Zealand, because they know that the permanent donor for them is actually the New Zealand, and China, which happens to be there, which may not be there. For this matter, many of these countries were also a part of the Belt Road Initiative, and the scope of the Belt Road Initiative is very much under question. So they actually also asked to be backed away from these things. But they are very much ready to actually be as a part of the Czech diplomacy. Now, this happens to be the game in which the things were being played. And for example, there's actually also an regional rivalry between them. So, for example, when Henry Puna, the former Cook Islands Prime Minister, he was actually made the Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum. Then the Micronesian countries, which happened to be there, they happened to back out the Pacific Islands Forum, and they said that we will actually form an own forum of ourselves. But then, when they understood that there is actually a permanent need for them, because they wanted to actually be a part of them, the US actually started to intervene more in this, because they understood that if there is going to be a separate entity of Micronesian countries in the Pacific Island Forums, that could actually jeopardize the US military assets in the Micronesian countries, for example, in Guam. So in that case, they understood that actually when the US started to intervene more pronouncedly, then they actually started to back it off from there. I mean, when I was actually there recently in the Regina dialogue, there were US representatives who are there. They were actually saying that every single word of the comprehensive strategic agreement between Cook Islands and China was discussed in DC, because it was not because they understood that these island chains will occupy important strategic postings for the US. I mean, whatever supremacy that they are having, the US is having, that is very much in the Pacific is very much actually a part of these islands. So they have actually started, and interestingly, if you see that actually it's very interesting. See, for example, during the Trump administration, the Biden administration, these islands, those were supposed to get more importance, but it was during the Obama administration it actually gained more importance. Basically, the reason was basically because Obama himself was born in Hawaii. Yeah. Okay, so he was brought up in Indonesia. So in that case, he understood the importance of these island chains, and that's why he actually made it surprise. He actually went on a very surprising visit to Australia, and that's when the 2000, 2000 military personnel were actually posing. 2000 military personnel were nothing when it comes to actually significant strategic importance, but they were actually based in Darwin. And that was actually getting a significant amount of importance. And interestingly, when Australia decided to join the Malabar or the Quad, it was very interesting. If you see that initially Australia has got 6 submarines, conventional submarines, which are actually rotated. And these 6 submarines were actually initially based in Sydney, not in Perth. But now, whatever that one actually, the 6 submarines with the AUKUS as a part of the agreement, it should not be based in Sydney, but in Perth. That sounds actually a little more interesting how things will be done. But that's how they will actually see it for the pattern. And if you see the defense white paper of these countries, say for example, if it is the defense white paper of France or the defense white paper of New Zealand and the defense white paper of Australia, they give a significant amount of strategic importance to these islands. And by the way, for example, New Zealand has got a constitutional commitment to protect these islands. That is very much there from 2010. Of course, they do actually say that they are actually a part of the 5. No, it's very interesting. Say for example, if New Zealand and Australia are actually a part of 5-point defense agreement, okay, which has got its base in Singapore even now. But these 5-point defense agreement, whichever they are having, which has aimed against Indonesia, because when they had this Malaysia and Indonesian war, the 5-point defense agreement came at that time that was actually based more against Indonesia. But now they would actually use, as a 5-point defense agreement along with Indonesia, if at all possible, to counter China in the Pacific Islands. That sounds actually the variation in which they think. That's the case even with Indonesia too. Indonesia is very much a part of the Pacific Islands, as I said. They were actually a part of the Malaysian group. They have their issues. The inter issues. I would say, for example, the Fijis do support what one would say the Kanak independence. Some of the members of the Fiji do have some kind of ethnic connectivity. They do support that, but that is very much opposed to a larger extent in Indonesia's grander scheme of things. So that happens even, for example, Fiji is also a Polynesian country. Despite being a Polynesian country, in Rotaman Islands, it does have Polynesian interest too. And it is to participate in Polynesian Spearhead Group, which came out in 2011. And New Zealand happens to be a part of that. And being in India would also be, I mean, like being as an active member of the Polynesian Spearhead Group, the group. And Chile happens to be actually a part of the Polynesian. So our interests are getting very much wide range. It's not only that we are actually focused very much on the diplomatic, interest. Our military interest is also going. I mean, we do have a kind of significant number of expatriate Indian population, which actually, I mean, after 1991, many of our software engineers happen to work in these islands. For example, Cook Islands also, we do have significant number of software. So in that case, they do actually know there's actually an open content of information with those people who come back to India. So in that case, our interest is varied, our interest is multi-layered. We have started to understand the military and the diplomatic importance of these islands. But actually, on a whole, I mean, on a holistic basis, what we have to do much more is that we need to get what one could say the foot on the ground, the thing. As such, on a day-to-day basis, for example, we need more diplomatic presence. Say, for example, there's actually a talk that US will also open its embassy in Cook Islands. We may actually also open our consulate there in Cook Islands or in Tonga or any of these countries, so that we could actually reach out to these countries much more on a day-to-day level basis. So that happens to be the case. And also, some of these countries, I mean, say for example, these countries which have got a significant, say for example, Australia and New Zealand, the Albanese government and the previous Jacinda Ardern government, I mean, she was actually, I can actually say it on a very personal level, Jacinda Ardern, she is known very much, but she is now in US. She has actually left the New Zealand politics. But the fact of the matter is, we are personal friends. I mean, I happened to walk along with Jacinda Ardern when she was actually an MP. That was in 2008. We used to actually were involved in campaigning. But she has got, because in our constituency in Auckland, there's a significant number of Pacific Islanders who are there. So she started to reach out more to these islands. Say, for example, she happened to take on a personal initiative to Tuvalu. I mean, she actually went on a boat trip to Tuvalu so that she could actually reach out to them. It's all actually, a little bit more history in nature. But what is happening right now is that it is true the fact that after the Chinese foreign minister visit in 2022, and the comprehensive strategic agreement came up in 2000, just now between Cook Islands and China, the interest of these islands not necessarily with us has increased, but it has also increased to other capitals, not necessarily in Canberra and Wellington, but also in DC also. I remember when there was actually Australian foreign minister Kevin Andrews, who visited IDSA around in 2015. And when he actually visited there in 2015, he actually talked about the India-Australian relations. And there was a naval officer called Prem Prakash Batra, who happens to write a lot about, he's actually based in US, but he was actually he would not in merchant navy. And he is one of the very few people who are actually visited all these countries as a part of the merchant navy. He used to ask our naval establishment, and also the National Maritime Foundation, which actually conducts the research on maritime issues. He used to actually vocally support the need for us to reach out more. He asked a question. He asked, as much as we actually, this was in 2015, as much as we talk about the Indo-Australia relations, that do we actually extend that kind of strategic partnership in Pacific Islands too? Though the Australian foreign minister was, diplomatically said he did not actually give an answer, but it is true that the interest will actually go beyond actually the region to the sea. And another way, when we actually talk about the geopolitics of this region, when we actually talk about the Indo-Pacific and the Asia-Pacific, previously the Indo-Pacific actually, what was Asia-Pacific and what was Indo-Pacific? There was actually a difference. See, the Asia-Pacific started from the eastern side of the Indian Ocean and it extended till till the Pacific Islands. Whereas when we talk about the Indo-Pacific, previously, it started from the western side of our Indian Ocean and it went till West Pacific and not entirely in the Pacific Islands. But that actually has started to change because it started to change because of the shifting of the US Pacific Command. Because the US Pacific Command was renamed as Indo-Pacific. And when we talk about the Indo-Pacific, then the Pacific Islands were also included as a part of the Indo-Pacific. No, that happens to be the change. And also some of these Pacific Islands also have what one could say connections. I mean, like the US Pacific Command, they very much are a part of that. As we have actually started to cooperate with the US, the Pacific Command, that actually happens to be the case in this, and we will be cooperating with the US also in these islands also. And interestingly, our Eastern Fleet, we do have, when we talk about the whole of the thing, we do happen to actually cooperate with the 5th Fleet and the 7th Fleet. Our Western Fleet and Eastern Fleet. I mean, there will be actually changing the way in which our theater commands are pursued and so forth. That's actually a topic for another day. And the fact of the matter is that we would like to also cooperating also with the 6th Fleet, because they do, the 6th Fleet also do have actually operations in the Pacific Islands too, and some of the Latin American group. But very much, of course, the 7th Fleet, the 7th Fleet and 5th Fleet, and also with the 6th Fleet. So that happens to be the change in mix and we will Pacific Fleet. And also, we also have what I could say, just 2 important points. One is that Andaman and Nicobar commands, I mean, the theater commands that we do have, I mean, like that actually happens to have, I mean, like they do have, they do reach out to the Southeast Asian countries. And that might actually change. Say, for example, in the next 15 years or 20 years, the case when we do have an ANC, what's called an ANC command, they might actually reach out for in the Pacific Island countries. And our own maritime security strategy document, which we did come out with, when you talk about the maritime doctrines, which came out in 2004 and 2007, 2004 and 2009, and the maritime strategy document, which came out in 2007, and the force structure document, which was also there in 2007, and we did come out with the maritime security strategy document in 2015. And interestingly, when you actually talk about the 2015 security strategy document, we see that not only talk about that what about the next security provider and area of responsibility, he did actually talk about the need for us to reach out to these Pacific Islands, because the area of responsibility was included till West Pacific. So that was actually Western, Southwestern Pacific. So that was actually a big it is that we actually thought about that. As we actually do our internal restructuring with the theater commands and so forth, we would also reach out more. Maybe in terms of maritime diplomatic approach, will be more. Say, for example, our port visits will increase. So that will actually increase the way in which the people perceive of things in the Pacific Islands in the overall geopolitics. So that happens. So I'll stop here and I will be happy to take questions.